our roundtable on development. Today we have with us Bert Lay, a returned Peace Corps volunteer from Central Africa, Jim Gardner, Professor of Management at the University of Utah, Gunsele Barak, Professor of Economics and Women's Studies at the University of Utah, and Ken Jameson, Professor of Economics at the University of Utah. And first, I'd like to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us today. We'd like to start with, to get an idea about the situation of poverty in the world today. And I was wondering, Gunsele, if you can start with that.
Sure. According to the World Bank estimates, in 1992, there were 1.3 billion people in the third world that lived below the poverty line, meaning below an income level in US dollars of $370 per year per household. And this amounts to about 30% of developing countries' population. So it is a pretty serious problem, but regionally there are quite a bit of variations too, and within regions, of course, there is a bit of variation as well. The problem is most severe in sub-Saharan Africa, where 50% of the population lives below this poverty line. And this is followed by Latin America, where 35% of the population lives below poverty line, and then by Asia, which is 25% poverty rate. But Asia is very heterogeneous. It has the two of the most populous countries and the poorest countries within it, namely Bangladesh and India. In Bangladesh, the poverty rate is 86%. In India, it's 48%. And but at the other end, there's Sri Lanka, where only 10% of the population is poor, and South Korea, where 16% of the population is poor. So clearly, there is quite a bit of heterogeneity in this region, and the problem is not as severe in all countries of the developing world. One thing to note, though, most of the countries that have severe poverty problems have low per capita incomes on average, and have serious distributional problems in that the income distribution is very skewed, where a small percentage of the population controls large share of the income of that country. We may want to perhaps take up the causes of this.
I think that you're, in the case of Latin America, the income distribution is clearly a major factor. You have you've had a skewed income distribution since the time of the colony, basically, and that has changed over time. It's traditionally been also a rural-urban split, but now you're finding again a growing urban poverty as you find the rural population moving to the cities. But I think the income distribution in Latin America has been a major factor and continues to be.
It's clearly a distinction in the recent period when there has been some emergence on trend. And to me, trends are as important as the static condition. And the East Asian countries who have achieved what we might call emergence or convergence on the industrial model in the last 20 years mostly had relatively level income distribution, and it has improved. There are variations on this. It was very level in China, for example, which is 20% of the world's population, and is spreading at a time when social development and the elimination of poverty are occurring in the country. So it kind of depends on where you came from.
Right.
And where we all came from originally was poverty was the condition of humanity.
Well, in fact, speaking of where we came from originally, perhaps we could trace out some of the historical developments of different countries, because if we all started at the same situation with the Big Bang, why is it that some countries develop and others didn't? And so perhaps you can...
I'd like to speak about the country where I served as a Peace Corps volunteer, and that's Malawi in Central Africa. I think Malawi is basically stuck in time. the majority of the populace is involved in subsistence agriculture. And the most remarkable thing that I witnessed was that the vast majority of the land that is grown with crops is tilled by hand hoe. So when you have that situation, when you have no industry or very little industry, no machines to help develop, certainly the Industrial Revolution never came to Malawi. But I think the people there are adapting, but certainly they all desire a better standard of living. But the population is exploding. So,
well, you know what? I think maybe the biggest counter to that would be Latin America, which at the time of the Spanish conquest back in the 1500s, you had fairly well-developed civilizations that had their problems, but large urban populations and very organized agricultural systems, irrigation systems. And then with colonization, you had that in some sense supplanted, or you had a Spanish and Portuguese overlay on that that led to a lot of the kind of tendencies that we see today in terms of income distribution, very unequal income distribution, and essentially natural resource exploitation. Then Latin America had its independence in the early 1800s and really simply put a different domestic elite on top of that and maintain the same kind of system. But that by the turn of the century, Argentina was one of the most developed countries in the world in terms of per capita income by 1900, because it's a very rich and very large agriculture country. But then in the 20th century, you find that a lot of the kind of dynamism of industrialization came, but it was all a kind of distorted industrialization. It really did not lead to a consistent and long-term development process there. But you go to Latin America today, into the major cities, and you are just as in any major city in the world. So you find a very large difference there with the African case that I think goes back to the historical experience.
certainly different African countries have very different stories. If you look at Nigeria, for instance, that has tremendous oil wealth, that boosts the standard of living for just about everyone. Different countries have very different views on education. Certainly in Malawi, education is a luxury, whereas in neighboring countries, the government has said everyone will have a kindergarten through 12th grade education. And as long as the education base is not there, and as long as the rural populace is uneducated, I don't see a very bright future. So.
Well, I think that both Ken and the Malawi experience are a kind of form a framework for historical dimension a little more, and also the Asian experience. I guess we don't really know what income distribution was among the income. It was certainly a well-organized polity, we know that. The ancient civilizations created a lot of surplus wealth and built pyramids, and later in the Western tradition, cathedrals, but income distribution was probably pretty lousy everywhere. Among the Greeks, probably pretty lousy. So when did the absence of poverty even become part of the human condition, except for a very, very small minority? Probably, you know, in the 16th century. I mean, with the Reformation, earlier with the Renaissance, the exploration of the world. So there has been a tendency, as knowledge has been created and diffused, for economic progress to occur and for people to relate to each other in different ways. And so broadly prosperous countries have formed. But this is a very recent, in my opinion, and still kind of a minority condition in the world. It's now changing very fast, in my opinion, and the changes from an economic point of view, to me, are larger than the very regrettable social conscience non-changes, which are also occurring, and in just the areas that you talked about. Gonzalez's statistics are, of course, correct until really you get the purchasing price parity issue into it, which kind of changes some of the relations. You would not add the Chinese to the poor under that condition, and maybe even a lot of the Indians. But
well, actually, these the $370 per year per household is purchasing power parity adjusted income level. So it does take into account the value of sort of basic subsistence goods, even if they're not marketed, you know, in the economies we're talking about. So it is a fairly conservative estimate.
In any event, there are a lot of very poor people, and the issue is what can be done about it. Some of it is what can be done about it. That is our key question. But you know, what conditions exist in countries that tend to inhibit the elimination of poverty, I think, is a very important thing.
In fact, I think I wanted to get back to this question about the historical development of these different countries. Perhaps we can uncover what are some of the causes of poverty. Why is in Central Africa you have these situations of extreme poverty, where in other countries in Asia they've done reasonably well, or in the Middle East some countries do better than others? What accounts for that difference? And perhaps you can...
Sure. I'm familiar a little bit with the Middle East and specifically Turkey there. Now, Middle East has of course, a distinct history in the sense that many of the countries of the Middle East have been beneficiaries of the oil-based nature of the economies. And that being an advantage, it also comes with several disadvantages, which comes with a main disadvantage in that their revenues, their incomes are dependent on the price of oil, which of course in the 70s, due to two major OPEC price hikes, have surged, and this has sort of spawned a development process in many countries, even if the particular countries were not oil exporters themselves. And the connection was, of course, that these countries provided migrant labor forces to those that were oil-rich. And so there was a lot of remittances flowing, and so that did boost the development process. But nonetheless, once the prices sort of subsided in the 80s, basically you have this sort of the underlying structures of these economies come through, in the sense that some of the countries in the region have had small populations, not enough human resources, and of course low educated, limited education in their populations, and very much dependent on the what happens to their external incomes.
Well, can you describe for me what are the characteristics of a country that's started out and has been very successful in terms of its developmental process, as opposed to a country that's been a failure?
Well, I can talk
if you're
about
a successful
Turkey.
Country, tell me something about what was necessary for that.
Come back to me for a failure or a near failure.
Well, Turkey in the Middle East sort of stands out in the sense that it does not have oil resources, but it is considered a fairly successful developing country in the category of newly industrializing countries in the world, which is sort of a dozen or so countries. I think the key ingredients of its success was that starting from its sort of early history, that is sort of pre-20th century history, it had a fairly equal distribution of land, fairly equal access to land, which sort of continued into the present, into the 60s and the 70s, and that provided food self-sufficiency as well as possibility for food exports for the country. And then in turn that permitted industrialization, successful industrialization drive.
Why is that? How does that work?
Well, basically it was able to feed its population, urban population, relatively easily, and yet at the same time boost the incomes of the
So you need
peasantry.
enough food from the land to feed people working in the factories, otherwise If you don't have enough food to feed them, they can't work in the factories, and you don't.
In turn, of course, the boosted incomes of the peasants provide a market for the industrial goods that are produced domestically. And so it was a very inward-oriented economy until about 1980, when that sort of began to change under external pressures. But that I would consider a sort of a internally well-articulated economy, which made it through relatively high growth rates and industrialization and relatively egalitarian, low poverty situation.
So I think a key difference here is that indeed the peasants are able to afford the goods. Exactly. But in Malawi, that's not so. And basically it is subsistence agriculture. Malawi does have exports, but they're largely agricultural products, tea, coffee, and so on. We know that the markets are relatively unstable. And these particular products can only be grown in part of the country. Of course, Malawi was a former British colony. And the British built quite a substantial infrastructure, and that infrastructure survives today, but is rapidly breaking down. And when it breaks down, if spare parts aren't available, things really go to pieces. But in this case, we're dealing with a situation where the country largely served to supply Great Britain's needs for these particular agricultural products.
On Great Britain's terms.
On Great Britain's terms. And so independence came in 1964. And Malawi was unique in that it kept ties open with South Africa because it's landlocked and it had no way to export its limited agricultural goods. So the problem is there is no industry, and that the agricultural products, the principal exports, are things which are not drawing huge amounts of external revenue.
I'd like to pick up on a couple of points that have been made that I can relate back to the Asian experience, but I think nothing, it seems to me, in society or economics is totally general, but cover quite a few cases. One is human capital. There seems to be
Which
is educated people, trained people, not necessarily skilled people, but people with a level of training, as I think the development definition. There seems to be some minimum level of that is related to the ability to emerge. Second, colonialism and or economic imperialism have been huge factors almost everywhere in the third world. And this is a movement which maybe isn't totally dead yet, but of which, say, the Vietnam War might have been the last death agonies on a very large scale. When decolonialization, if I can say such a grotesque word, occurred and how thorough it was is a key thing. East Asia, I exclude Japan, which I consider an OECD country and hardly an Asian country at all, but East Asia was essentially either under direct political military colonial control or under economic control by the West until very, very recently. And the revolutions are much newer there than they are in most of the rest of the world. So the social order was overturned pretty thoroughly in big countries like China, like Indonesia. And that created the basis for a different kind of a start. So some of the things that Ken mentioned, the colonial order really remaining among the Creoles in Latin America, which it did. It just different people became the oligarchs. Really, it all got set aside there. So that's new. Furthermore, most of these Asian countries had between a surplus almost, abundant, or at least adequate human capital. These were countries that respected education. By and large, the people were trained. Very important. But the turning point in explosive development and in improvement in the economic conditions, and more slowly in the social conditions in some cases, really was when they turned from narcissism, the inward-looking autarkies that their immediate pre-colonial or post-colonial experience was, and became part of the integrated world economy with a fairly aggressive approach to it. We not only want to participate, we want to gain from it. And when these changes occurred, half of the people in the world in these countries began to emerge.
To wrap this up, I'd like to ask each of you if you're optimistic or pessimistic about the future. You want to start, Bert?
Unfortunately, I'm pessimistic, and I would just like to add that one of the major reasons I'm pessimistic is AIDS. AIDS in Africa is decimating the middle class and the educated. There were professors at the college where I taught who were dying of AIDS. My students, who were biology students, thought that AIDS stood for, was an acronym for, an American invention to discourage sex. I think that there is going to be more and more and more trouble brewing in sub-Saharan Africa as they lose their middle class to this vicious disease. Mm-hmm. I don't see a really positive future.
Why does it hit the middle class?
The middle class is the urban class. They tend to be more, they have extra money to spend. The men perhaps get around a little bit more. They don't have the social mores of the village where it's inappropriate to, everybody knows everybody else's business there. But if you have a little extra spending money in the city, problems arise. Mm-hmm. You can pretty much imagine. Mm-hmm. So it is really hitting the middle class. It is now spreading to the villages, I might add. And in Uganda, the entire middle-aged population has just been decimated. Grandparents are taking care of infants now. And the grandparents, this social security system is breaking down. The grandparents now have to try to go back out to the fields and grow the crops to feed their grandchildren because their children have long since died due to AIDS.
I'm optimistic, but I think only in the sense of recognizing some major threats. Certainly this being one of them. And although now Thailand, which has been sort of in the same pattern as the AIDS belt in Africa, seems to be coming a little bit into control. The extent of the problem, for example, in India, really isn't even known. Mm-hmm. And culturally, there are a lot of reasons to think it might be very large. So that's an issue. Another huge issue is in the rapid emergence of countries. The cultural shock is very, very high. And the traditions, which to some degree inhibit, not totally, but to a considerable degree inhibit corruption, exploitation in the industrialized world, don't exist. So corruption in reforming economies is a huge threat to a reaction that might send it all back. I think ideological and religious fanaticism is a huge threat to development. And to the degree that this begins to motivate countries as against social objectives and economic objectives, we need to worry a lot.
Well, I'm pessimistic. I think except for a handful of countries, the prospects look grim for the vast majority of third world countries. And one of the primary reasons why I feel that way has to do with an issue that we have not yet talked about and which has been very dominant for much of the third world in the past decade and a half, which is the debt crisis and its consequences. And many of the third world countries were heavily indebted in the 70s or built up their debt in order to finance development projects. And this sort of erupted into a debt crisis in the early 80s. And then they were, in order to borrow further, these countries were given the option of following certain types of economic strategies. And the experience, and we have sort of a rather long experience now of about 10 to 15 years in these countries, has been that these policies, by the way, they're sort of imposed by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank as these sort of two international lending institutions on these countries. And these policies have created recessionary conditions and have actually aggravated the poverty problem rather than helping it. Now, the World Bank and the IMF, of course, are presuming that, or are hoping that, growth process will start when the countries follow these prescriptions. And they're sort of assuming that this is going to happen relatively quickly, and the sort of the poverty problem can therefore be alleviated subsequently. But the experience has been that the turnaround has not been happening, and the countries are not only having to sort of repay some of the debt still, but also under the grip of these two international institutions, which are creating misery for them in terms of, well, the vast majority of the population being deprived of basic resources that they used to rely on for minimal survival, in terms of subsidy cuts, in terms of programs that would sort of function as safety nets.
Do we get a final rebuttal?
I get to say something.
Oh, sure.
I don't know if I'm optimistic or pessimistic, but I always say I have a bias for hope. And I think one of the things that an involvement in any third world country is shows the kind of range and variety and really the wonder of life as people, wonderful people, try to deal with that. Coming out of Latin America, I think there's a reason for a bias for hope despite the debt overhang, and I think that has to do with democracy, that people are participating more and there are new movements in that direction. And I think part of my bias for hope is I think Americans are going to finally realize that the prosperity of the third world countries is very important to the United States as well, that if we end up competing with people who work for 40 cents a day, we simply are not going to be able to compete except by pushing down our own standard of living of our own workers. And I think that has been one of the factors in what's become an issue in some of the presidential campaigns this year. So I think we will realize that prosperity in third world countries is very important to us, and we need to pay attention to it, and we need to encourage it wherever we can. And so I have a bias for hope.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today, and I hope you enjoyed watching our roundtable. Thank you.